Basic photography. Before we talk about the material, let's talk about the history of photography. The basic concept of photography has been around since about the 5th century BC. It wasn't until an Iraqi scientist developed something called the camera obscura in the 11th century that the art was born. Even then, the camera did not actually record images. It simply projected them onto another surface. The images were also upside down, though they could be traced to create accurate drawings of real subjects, such as buildings. The first camera obscura used a pinhole in a tent to project an image from outside the tent into the darkened area. It wasn't until the 17th century that the camera obscura became small enough to be portable. Basic lenses to focus the light were also introduced around this time. Photography as we know it today began in the late 1830s in France. Joseph Nicephore Nice used a portable camera obscura to expose a pewter plate coated with bitumen light. This is the first recorded image that did not fade quickly. Niepce's success led to a number of other experiments, and photography progressed very rapidly. Daguerreotypes, emulsion plates, and weight plates were developed almost simultaneously in the mid to late 1800s. With each type of emulsion, photographers experimented with different chemicals and techniques. In the 1870s, photography took another huge leap forward. Richard Maddox improved on a previous invention to make dry gelatin plates that were nearly equal to wet plates in speed and quality. These dry plates could be stored rather than made as needed. This allowed photographers much more freedom in taking photographs. The process also allowed for smaller cameras that could be handheld. As exposure time decreased, the first camera with a mechanical shutter was developed. Photography was only for professionals and the very rich until George Eastman started a company called Kodak in the 1880s. Eastman created a flexible raw film that did not require constantly changing the solid plates. This allowed him to develop a self-contained box camera that held 100 film exposures. The camera had a small single lens with no focusing adjustment. The consumer would take pictures and send the camera back to the factory for the film to be developed and prints made, much like modern disposable cameras. This was the first camera inexpensive enough for the average person to afford. In the 1980s and in 1990s, numerous manufacturers worked on cameras that stored images electronically. The first of these were point and shot cameras that used digital media instead of film. By 1991, Kodak had produced the first digital camera that was advanced enough to be used successfully by professionals. Other manufacturers quickly followed, and today Canon, Nikon, Pentax, and other manufacturers offer advanced digital SLR cameras. Basic functions of camera. Shutter release button. The button that is pushed to take a photograph. It is variously also known as the release or release button. There is normally a two-stage push. The first type of button push is often referred to as the half push. The button is pressed until a little resistance is felt and pushed no further. Dial mode button. A dial used on the digital cameras to change the camera's mode. Most digital cameras include digital SLR and SLR-like cameras. Support modes selectable either by a dial or from a menu. In some cameras, it consists of A. Auto, M. Manual, S. Shutter priority, and P. Programmed auto. Aperture. The size of an opening within the camera lens that allows light to pass through the lens. Exposure meter. Exposure meter, also called light meter, photographic auxiliary device that measures the intensity of light and indicates proper exposure. For example, the combination of aperture and shutter speed for a film or image sensors of a specific sensitivity. Triangle exposure. There are three components of triangle exposures, which is ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. ISO is sensitivity of the image sensor, where aperture is a measure of how open or closed the lens iris is. The shutter speed is a measure of how long the shutter remains open and thus how long the sensor is exposed to the light. As you can see from the picture, ISO, shutter, and aperture have a very different function. For ISO, less ISO will give very less grainy, however the sensitivity to the light is very low. For shutter, the fastest the shutter speed, it will catch the image immediately without any blur. However, if we have a slow shutter speed, the object will tend to be blurry and it intended for some function and some purposes. For the aperture, the smaller the aperture, the focus of the background and subject can be managed equally. However, for a large aperture, we can differentiate between the background and the subject by the blurry of the background or the blurry of the subject. So first, let's talk about ISO. How does it work? The lower the number, the less sensitive your camera is to light and the finer the resulting grain. Higher numbers of ISO mean your sensor is more sensitive to light, which allow you to use your camera in darker situation or in a darker room. Normally, the ISO 100 is a standard ISO on most camera. It will give you lovely crisp shots. So, when you use it with low ISO, you can use it if there is plenty of light and if you want a little grain, or if you're using a tripod and the subject is stationary. When the object is dark and you want grain photos and you don't have a tripod, you can use high ISO. And if the subject is moving, it also prefer to use high ISO. So can you see the difference between the left photo and the right photo? So on the right photo, there is a high ISO, then it is full of unpleasant noise. However, on the left photo, which is using low ISO, it is completely clean. Aperture. The aperture is like the pupil for your camera system. which can open and close to change the amount of light that passes through. Note the 9 blades in the lens, which form a diaphragm to block any light that tries to pass, except through the center. So, what is aperture again? The aperture, in a mechanical sense, refers to the size of the opening at the back of the lens, which controls how much light is being passed onto the camera sensor. The aperture, often called f-stop, is important to the exposure of your photograph, but it also affects how much of your image is in focus or the depth of field. This is an important stylistic choice and impacts the look and the feel of your image. Shutter speed. The largest lens opening allows the fastest shutter speed. So in keeping with the ideas of the extremes, note the following. You will always attain the fastest possible shutter speed at any given ISO when you use the largest possible lens opening. You will be able to attain the slowest possible shutter speed at any given ISO by using the smallest possible lens opening. One photo op, 6 correct exposures. So choose a moving object and set your camera to aperture priority mode and your ISO to 100 or 200 if that's the lowest your camera offers. Set your aperture wide open and take an image of the action before you. You have just recorded an exposure at the fastest possible shutter speed based on the ISO in use, the light falling on your subject, and of course your use of the largest possible lens opening. Fast and moderate speeds. Freezing action. There are many keys to recording great action shots: lens choice, distance to the subject, direction of the subject, and shutter speed. Next to ISO, choosing the right shutter speed is the most important element. For most outdoor action-filled shots, shutter speeds of 1/500 or 1/1000 second are the norm, and for many experienced shutters, getting to these 1/500 and 1/1000 second exposures is often the direct result of using the right ISO. Freezing action 1/250. No matter what actions you are photographing, if that action is coming at you, you can safely shot at 1/250 seconds. This is especially true with regard to sports. Freezing action 1/500. There will be times when your point of view may allow you to be within several feet of the action, and with your wide-angle lens at the ready, by all means, employ the faster shutter speeds of 1/1000 or 1/2000 seconds. But remember that when you wish to freeze action coming in from the left or right, or action that is moving up and down, for the most part, 1/500 second is more than sufficient. The art of slowing down. Slower shutter speeds offer far more outlets for creativity than faster ones. Yet at the same time, slower shutter speeds are incredibly unpredictable. It is in this unpredictability that, if you can be patient, you will often find in the diamond in the rough. Action-filled subjects take on whole new meaning when deliberately photographed at unusually slower shutter speeds. Making rain only with 1/60 seconds. The first thing to do is set your shutter speed to 1/60 seconds. Then make sure to use an ISO of 100 or 200. Move in close so that your backlit subject. Adjust your aperture until the light meter indicates a correct exposure. And then move back a bit and frame up your overall composition, and with your camera on the tripod and your exposure set, fire up the sprinkler. Panning. When moving subjects enter the frame from the left or right, you simply follow it with the camera, moving in that same direction while depressing the shutter release button. To ensure moving subjects remains relatively stationary and sharp focus. To pan effectively, use at least 1/30 second. Consider panning at even slower shutter speeds, 1/15 or 1/8, etc. Must have an appropriate background. The more busy and colorful the background, the better panned subject will look in front of it. Composition rules. The first is rule of thirds. You have to train yourself to split your camera screen into a grid, and then keep in mind the key points of intersection and place important elements along those lines for visual appeal. This asymmetric composition in photography works well for any genre, including landscapes, still life photography, and portraits. The golden ratio. The golden ratio differentiates from the rule of the thirds by the balance of the photograph. Leading lines. Take advantage of structures and the lines of natural landscapes, and then use them in proportion to your subjects to lead the eye into the picture. A centered and symmetrical photography composition is the most preferable one in this case to help the viewer focus on a subject or object. Diagonals. So one thing about diagonal lines that differentiates it from the other composition technique is the lines help create movement in the photograph even when the subjects are still. This is a great tip for photographers that want to step outside of perfect compositions yet still create appealing photography compositions with the help of diagonal lines. Frame within frame. As for the example of the picture here, the outside structures can serve as natural frames. This composition in photography is also called frame within the frame. What makes a photograph like this interesting is that it is soothing to an eye that we're seeing a neat frame that is already part of the shot. Figure to ground. Let's try to focus on your subjects and make them stand out by narrowing in on the contrast between the subject and the background. The more contrast, the more dramatic your shots and the more prominent your subject. Fill the frame. Get up close and personal with your subjects. Have them fill in the frame so that they are the focus and the dominant feature of the photograph. Center dominant eye. Place a dominant eye in the center of the photograph, and this will make the photograph more alluring as it appears that the subject's eye are following the viewer. Patterns and repetition. There is a reason why we love patterns. They are aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Another aspect to explore is including something in a photograph that interrupts a pattern as a way of including an element of surprise. Symmetry and asymmetry. The same goes for a slight variation of the style. Asymmetrical shots that include empty space for visual interest. Use the first photo composition rule in this list to find out where to place your subject. Thank you.